Okay, so Liza P came out. I wasn't really gonna get it, but after playing Armored Core, I was in the mood to play a Souls game, and I was gonna play Bloodborne, but I thought, why not play the new Bloodborne? Bloodborne, but Pinocchio. So I beat Liza P. I beat Liza P, and here are my thoughts about it. The shortest review I will give of this game is that it is a good game, like a really good game, almost. If just a few things about it were tweaked, or if there was like a patch that they can change a few things, it would be a really good game. Besides that, there is something really interesting about Liza P I'm going to get into later. I think it is a very fascinating game, and hopefully you stick around just because I think everybody feels this way about one or two games every now and then. But let's talk about the bits and bobs of Liza P before we get all philosophical about game design. Said that weird. Philosophical about game design. Anyway, the graphics are really good, the art direction is good, and the gameplay is good enough. It's very solid. The level design is really linear, especially compared to other games in the similar genre. Like, you see a sprawling world in front of you, but you really only go down a handful of alleyways and hallways, and these big giant buildings you're scaling are really just going to like a few rooms and then taking an elevator or two. I'll say the bosses start off pretty good. The bosses are probably the most contentious aspect of Liza P. Every boss after the Archbishop is either tedious, annoying, exhausting, or just flat out bad. The game has a perfect parry system. You parry or you block at just the right time, you will perfect parry, and you won't take any stamina or HP damage. Otherwise, blocking, you take both stamina and HP damage. You can dodge, you can roll sometimes. It's kind of standard Souls, but it is more standard Bloodborne because there isn't really a shield. This game is heavily inspired by Bloodborne. Its aesthetic, its gameplay, but there is also a little bit of Sekiro in there. They really want you to parry sometimes, and then sometimes they really want you to dodge and be aggressive. If you don't know Bloodborne, if you're not familiar with Bloodborne, I don't know, go watch a review of it. It is a better game than Liza P. Hopefully that's not too controversial of a take. Play Bloodborne instead. But if you can't play Bloodborne, play Sekiro, which is also better than Liza P. Let's get started then. This is the really interesting thing I wanted to talk about, though, is there is this hypothesized observed phenomenon, which is technically what it is, where something that is close to human but is slightly off creates an unsettling feeling in a human. Take the puppets from Liza P, right? They're pretty noticeably mechanical. Even though they are humanoid, they look like robots. There's more robot than human in their appearance, and there are clear indicators for them that they are robots, so that it's clear what the difference is between what these robot puppets are and what real people are. But when something looks and acts almost identically to a human, but they do a few things that are slightly off, or they look slightly off, like their eyes are too big or something, that almost humanness is off-putting. It makes us feel uncomfortable, unnatural. And that effect is called the uncanny valley. Basically, the more something looks like a human, the more we judge it as a human, and the more it fails to live up to those human expectations, either in how it looks or how it acts, can cause some pretty weird feelings. It can make you feel uncomfortable. It's uncanny. It's unnatural. And I'm bringing all this up because Liza P lives in the uncanny valley. And no, it's not because of the puppets. It's because of the gameplay. Liza P is very obviously inspired by From Software's Bloodborne, right? A safe way to describe the game in 2 words is Bloodborne Pinocchio, which isn't inaccurate. However, because Liza P does so many things right and so many things like a Souls game, it becomes harder and harder to not judge it like a Souls game. If kind of like how something that is uncanny in the uncanny valley is too close to a human, but not, distinctly robotic enough that it becomes uncanny. Liza P is so much like the specific type of game that it's a little weird, it's a little unnatural, and for me, I start judging it, I start giving it the expectations that I would from a From Software Souls title. If I had to compare Bloodborne Pinocchio to the rest of the From Software games, it would sit nicely at the bottom as the worst of them. If I compared Lies of P to, I don't know, anything else, it would be a really good game, aside from the bosses, and I'll get to the bosses. But Lies of P is a technically impressive game. It's mechanically sound, it does a lot of things right, it captures a feeling of fluidity in the gameplay that feels good, it offers a lot of weapons and customization and all these different options, visually it's impressive. It does a lot of good stuff. So much good stuff that it becomes easy to compare it to games that are just so far out of its league. Lies of P, no matter how good it is in the minor leagues. And it does enough that you kind of want to compare it to its major league brothers. But a lot of stuff in that game just feels off. Voice acting is weird, the plot is a huge mess, even the lore doesn't really explain things. The level design, like I said, is extremely linear. But not only is it linear, it doesn't make sense naturally as a city. Like an absolute prime example is that a main hideout of some bosses of the game, you have to fight through this whole underbelly of enemies and violent criminals and monsters and stuff. And then once you beat their boss in their own home where they literally sleep and live, there just is an elevator that takes you exactly to where you sleep and live. And that's just bad. That's kind of immersion breaking. In a better game, that would be a real complaint. However, you can see what I'm getting at. For Lies of P, it doesn't really matter, right? You're not judging it to those standards. But it gets good enough at a lot of things that sometimes I just started judging it to much higher standards than what it was because it totally outpaced its weight class. Enemy placement is also laughable. Lies of P simply loves ambushes. Enemies are constantly hiding around every corner or waiting to drop down from areas above. And the enemies are just kind of there, like a lot of them don't even make sense to be there. Eventually, it just becomes a combination of puppets and zombies, even in areas where there should really only be just puppets or just zombies. And again, in a better game, this isn't around. They take more time. They take more thought. Stuff matters. Items are the best example because if you think about how item placement exists in Souls games, they are placed or found in areas that have meaning. It means something when you find an item somewhere. It helps tell a story if you find a ring on a corpse in a forest or something, or an NPC that you kill was carrying a certain weapon. And there are so many very successful lore channels that exist dedicated to figuring out all the reasoning and rationales and telling all the stories of why certain items are placed where they are. But Lies of P doesn't really do any of that stuff, and it certainly doesn't do any of that stuff as well as a Souls game. It just kind of throws a bunch of stuff around and in a vague representation, as a imitation, sort of a puppet version of a Souls game, And I'm okay with it. I think it is fine. Because at the end of the day, I am comparing it to a lot of these things that a better series, like a legendary series of games, and I don't love every From Software game or every Souls game, but they are like very good, very successful video games. I'm fine with Lies of P being what it is, and it doesn't have to compete with that stuff. It can just be its own little game. However, what I'm not fine with is that it is a game that is focused pretty much mainly on action, but I wish the action was done better. Okay, I have two real complaints here. One is way larger than the other. The smaller of the complaints is how often my weapons kept hitting walls or objects and just bouncing back at me. Like, this shit is a problem in the Souls series, and I know I'm not alone in finding it extremely annoying when enemies can attack through walls, but if I swing my sword in a narrow hallway, I clang on the side. That's super frustrating, and it happens quite often in Lies of P. In fact, if you're using, a larger weapon, if you're going a strength build, you're going to be clanging against a lot of stuff because the level design just kind of is a lot of narrow walkways and hallways. But the second and the bigger problem, probably the biggest complaint everybody has about Lies of P, and I'm no different, is that the bosses are just too hard. And they are too hard in all of the wrong ways. I'm going to try and keep the complaining to a minimum, but there is a lot you can complain about regarding the combat and the bosses specifically, but I'm just going to try and narrow it down to kind of the big thing. I try to narrow it down to like the big things about it. And the biggest issue I have is that these boss fights take too long. Enemies have either too much health or players deal too little damage. One of those things needs to be changed. It's easier to fix one of those two problems than the actual problem, which is the strategy for beating almost every boss after the puppet factory is to just wait for the big bad guy to stop flailing around, and then you get to hit them once or twice if you're lucky. And then you go back to running away and dodging. Bosses can just keep attacking and flailing and swinging away, and they might not even use the moves that have recovery time that let them be vulnerable. They just might keep using combos that are not punishable. And so many bosses, when they hit you, their attack lets them jump all the way back to the other side of the arena. So now they're super unpunishable. And I don't want to get into a ranting tangent. The real issue here, which is why I suggested instead of trying to fix enemy AI or reduce their combos or anything, just make bosses have less health so the fights aren't as long, or you make players deal more damage so the fights aren't as long, is that Souls games have a way to mitigate the difficulty. You can adjust it. Lies of P really doesn't have a way to mitigate the difficulty. You can summon an AI specter, but these little AI companions are really bad. And they almost always die during phase 1 of the boss fights. And almost every boss fight is a 2-phase fight at minimum. You can't really grind for items because quartz are limited currency and you can only carry a certain amount of throwable items at a time. The average person doesn't want to spend an hour or 2 hours banging their head against a wall of a boss until the stars align and they do moves that are punishable, or the player finally has enough patience to sit into upwards of 15 minutes for a boss fight. The difficulty is just frustration at having such long, tedious boss fights that are a result of high HP bosses and low player damage. I tried my hardest. I did beat the game, and I found it to be really frustrating. There is a lot to like, but if the bosses, and I'm okay with dying, I'm okay with trying to learn stuff, but if they didn't take me so long, if they weren't so annoying, if the bosses were just tuned down even a little bit, I think I would really like this game. It's fun. It's a good game. There are so many moments of joy and pure genius that are in Lies of P when it comes to action and the weapons and the way you can customize them and craft them into your own sort of unique style if you want to. There is a lot of cool stuff in this game, but once you get past the first sort of act, God, the game becomes insufferable. It's just, I hated it. I was so mad I was playing it when a bunch of other cool stuff was coming out at the same time, and I couldn't believe I was spending my free time fighting the same boss over and over and over again because it has to have a phase 2 or phase 3, or it summons multiple bosses at the same time, just to be an extra bit of difficult, just to be even more annoying. There's plenty in this game that I didn't talk about, but it is basically the best non-From Software Souls-like game that I've played. If only the bosses were balanced a little bit better, then this game could maybe rival my least favorite of From Software's catalog. But as it is now, Lies of P just kind of sits as a weird imitation, like a little puppet in the uncanny valley.